Picture this scene. The year is 1885. From the grand halls of European diplomacy, a new humanitarian hero emerges, King Leopold II of Belgium. He convinces the world he harbors but one benevolent desire: to bring civilization, Christianity, and commerce to the untamed heart of Africa, to abolish the Arab slave trade and usher in an era of enlightenment. His grand ambition, seemingly noble, is to establish the Congo Free State, a vast territory in Central Africa, under his personal rule, not for profit, but for progress. But what the world hailed as a philanthropic endeavor, what countless missionaries and explorers believed was a genuine mission of mercy, was, in reality, the genesis of a horror so profound, so utterly depraved, that it would ultimately claim an estimated 10 million innocent lives, turning the Congo into a private slaughterhouse for one man's insatiable greed. You are about to enter the blood-soaked heart of darkness, where the philanthropist king carved an empire not with civilizing light, but with the severed hands of an entire population. If stories that expose history's most monstrous hypocrisies and the unimaginable depths of human cruelty grip your soul, then lend your unwavering attention here. Hit that like button to acknowledge the untold suffering. Subscribe to ensure these crucial histories are never forgotten. And tell us in the comments where in the world you are bearing witness to this chilling truth. Leopold II ascended to the Belgian throne in 1865, a king with a kingdom, but no empire. Unlike the sprawling colonial possessions of Britain, France, or Germany, tiny Belgium possessed no overseas territories. This fact gnawed at Leopold, a man whose ambition was as vast and untamed as the continents he coveted. He saw himself as a grand strategist, a visionary destined to elevate his small nation onto the global stage, and he understood that colonies were the ultimate symbols of national power and personal prestige. Yet, his initial attempts to acquire territories in places like Argentina, Fiji, or the Philippines met with failure, often due to his parliament's reluctance to fund such risky ventures. Undeterred, Leopold pursued a more insidious strategy, one shrouded in the guise of scientific exploration and humanitarian zeal. He understood the moral sensibilities of the European powers, particularly the growing anti-slavery movement. In 1876, he convened the Brussels Geographical Conference, inviting renowned explorers, geographers, and philanthropists from across Europe. There, he unveiled his audacious plan, the creation of the International African Association, IAA. Its stated purpose? To civilize the Congo Basin, to eradicate the brutal Arab slave trade that plagued the region, and to establish scientific research stations and free trade routes. He presented himself not as a monarch seeking dominion, but as a benevolent patron of humanity, an enlightened sovereign, committed to the upliftment of Africa. Imagine the grand pronouncements, the eloquent speeches delivered with an air of profound sincerity. Leopold painted a picture of a continent languishing in darkness, awaiting the light of European progress. His words, carefully chosen and expertly delivered, resonated with the prevailing sentiments of the age, the white man's burden to bring order and morality to the primitive world. He pledged to open the heart of Africa to commerce and Christianity, promising that his enterprise would be a civilizing mission benefiting all. This facade was meticulously constructed, designed to disarm suspicion and gather international support. He even enlisted the famed Anglo-American explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, fresh from his epic traverse of the Congo River, to serve his cause. Stanley, lured by Leopold's promises and the prospect of further exploration, was unknowingly becoming a key instrument in the king's grand deception, charting territories that would soon become a private gulag. The late 19th century was indeed the era of the scramble for Africa, a feverish, almost manic race among European powers to stake their claims on the continent's vast resources. It was a period driven by a potent cocktail of industrial greed, burgeoning nationalism, and a self-serving belief in racial superiority. Britain, with its vast empire, eyed territories from Cairo to the Cape. France pushed eastward from its West African strongholds, dreaming of a transcontinental dominion. Germany, a latecomer to the imperial game, aggressively sought its place in the sun, carving out swaths of East and Southwest Africa. Portugal clung desperately to its ancient coastal claims in Angola and Mozambique, while Italy looked to the Horn of Africa. Each nation vied for dominance, motivated by the insatiable demands of the Industrial Revolution for raw materials, minerals, timber, agricultural products, and the promise of new markets for manufactured goods. They drew arbitrary lines on maps, often with shocking ignorance of the diverse African societies, cultures, and established trade routes, lines that would, with devastating consequence, define African borders and spark conflicts for generations. The continent, seen as a prize, a vast untapped treasure chest, became the ultimate chessboard for European ambition. Amidst this chaotic, predatory fervor, Leopold, ever the cunning diplomat and master illusionist, shrewdly positioned his International African Association, IAA, not as another hungry contender, but as a neutral, benevolent entity. He portrayed it as a philanthropic endeavor, a high-minded buffer between the rival imperial ambitions, a selfless project dedicated to the upliftment of Africa. His genius lay in understanding that while outright conquest would ignite suspicion and opposition, a humanitarian mission could disarm the very powers he intended to outmaneuver. He cultivated an image of a benign protector, a selfless patron of science and civilization, rather than a grasping conqueror. His agents fanned out across Europe and America, spreading carefully crafted narratives of African suffering and the IAA's noble quest to bring light to a dark continent. He sponsored lavish lectures and published scientific papers, all designed to distract from his true, rapacious intentions. His moment of profound, almost unbelievable triumph arrived at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. This was no ordinary diplomatic gathering. It was a watershed moment in global history where the great European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and a host of others, along with the United States, gathered not to avert conflict, but to formalize the partition of Africa. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, host of the conference, sought to stabilize the volatile scramble and establish ground rules for colonial acquisition, particularly regarding navigation and trade rights along the crucial Congo and Niger rivers. Each nation came to the table with its own territorial ambitions, its own claims, its own strategies for securing a slice of the vast African pie. Leopold, present not as a representative of Belgium, but as the self-appointed chairman of the International African Association, unleashed a masterful diplomatic offensive. His delegates, including the famed explorer Henry Morton Stanley, now a willing, or perhaps unwittingly complicit, instrument of the king, and the influential American diplomat Henry Shelton Sanford, worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They presented the IAAA as a truly international, non-profit enterprise, distinct from any national colonial agenda. They argued passionately that the Congo Basin, a territory of immense size and strategic importance, an astonishing 80 times the size of Belgium itself, should be recognized not as a traditional Belgian colony, but as the Congo Free State. This, they declared, would be a free trade zone, a neutral territory open to the commerce of all nations, and above all, a humanitarian project dedicated to eradicating the Arab slave trade and bringing Christian civilization to the indigenous populations. The assembled diplomats, many swayed by Leopold's eloquent appeals to morality and the promise of unfettered access to a vast new market, swallowed the deception whole. They saw a convenient buffer, a less threatening alternative to one of their rivals gaining such a colossal territory. Through masterful political maneuvering and a relentless, pervasive propaganda campaign that played directly into the prevailing white man's burden ethos of the era, Leopold achieved the unthinkable. He convinced the other nations to grant him personal sovereignty over this immense Central African heartland, transforming it into a sovereign entity under his sole, absolute rule. The irony was profound, a chilling historical paradox that would define a century of suffering. While other European powers negotiated for mere slices of the African pie, arguing over borders and resource rights with heated diplomatic exchanges, Leopold, a king without an empire, secured an entire continent-sized country as his personal fiefdom. The treaties signed in Berlin, draped in noble rhetoric of free trade, humanitarianism, and the abolition of slavery, created a monstrous legal framework for one of history's most absolute and unaccountable dictatorships. The Congo Free State was indeed a legal anomaly from its very inception. It was not a colony governed by the Belgian parliament, subject to some degree of public and legislative oversight, however minimal. Instead, it was a nation-state owned by a single man, King Leopold II, personally and utterly divorced from any genuine international scrutiny or democratic accountability. This unprecedented status, a private dominion masquerading as a benevolent state, would prove catastrophic. It meant there were no checks and balances, no parliamentary debates, no public expenditure reports, and no genuine legal recourse for the millions who would soon suffer under its yoke. Leopold had ingeniously transformed the lofty principles of humanitarianism, scientific progress, and free trade into a meticulous smokescreen, a deceptive legal instrument for unbridled personal exploitation. It was a colossal act of global chicanery, setting the stage for a regime of terror unique in its systematic brutality and its utter lack of accountability to any external body. The ink was barely dry on the Berlin Act, signifying this audacious acquisition, before the Free and Congo Free State would take on a terrifying hollow resonance. The mask of philanthropy, meticulously crafted and flawlessly worn, was about to slip, paving the way for a horror that would soon grip the very heart of Africa, a terror far beyond the wildest nightmares of the European diplomats who had so casually handed a continent to a king. With the Congo Free State formally recognized as his personal domain, Leopold II's mask of philanthropy swiftly fell away, revealing the rapacious greed that had always been his true motive. The lofty promises of free trade and humanitarian endeavor evaporated, immediately replaced by secret decrees for vast concessions that carved up the territory for his personal profit. He declared that all vacant land, meaning any land not actively cultivated by the indigenous population, a concept utterly foreign to the Congolese communal land ownership traditions, now belonged to the state, which meant it belonged to him. This audacious legal maneuver effectively dispossessed millions of Africans of their ancestral lands, reducing them overnight to tenants on their own soil. His vast territory was rich in two highly lucrative commodities: ivory, prized for its beauty and scarcity, and wild rubber, whose demand exploded first with inflatable bicycle tires, and later the insatiable maw of the burgeoning automobile industry. The wild rubber vines, abundant in the Congo's dense forests, became the engine of Leopold's personal fortune and the instrument of unspeakable suffering. To maximize profits, Leopold instituted a brutal, all-encompassing system of forced labor that became the very bedrock of his economic empire. His administration unilaterally declared all vacant land as state property, an act of wholesale theft that stripped the indigenous Congolese population of their means of sustenance and traditional livelihoods. The indigenous Congolese population, once promised freedom from slavery, became enslaved en masse to impossible rubber quotas. Each village, each man, woman, and even child was given an impossible quota of rubber to collect every fortnight, often requiring arduous journeys deep into dangerous, malarial jungles where disease, venomous snakes, and predatory animals were constant threats. These journeys could take days, forcing collectors to build temporary camps, further separating them from their families and farms. The quotas were deliberately set beyond reasonable human capacity, ensuring perpetual failure and therefore perpetual debt to the regime, trapping entire communities in an inescapable cycle of servitude. Failure to meet these quotas resulted in swift, horrifying punishment, often including the systematic destruction of food crops and homes, a deliberate strategy to starve communities into submission. This was not merely economic exploitation, it was a vast, meticulously organized system of terror, designed to extract every ounce of resource from the land, irrespective of the human cost, reducing an entire populace to mere cogs in a colossal, murderous extractive machine. At the heart of this abominable system was the Force Publique, Leopold's private army, numbering in the tens of thousands. This mercenary force was a chilling mirror of the empire it served, composed primarily of African soldiers from other regions, often coerced or kidnapped as children from distant villages, ripped from their families, and brutalized into absolute obedience. These young, impressionable recruits were then weaponized, turned against the very people they could have called kin, forging a terrifyingly efficient instrument of oppression. They were led by ruthless European officers, a grim collection of former soldiers of fortune, ex-criminals, and men driven by avarice and a profound lack of moral compass, drawn to the Congo by the promise of unfettered power and wealth. The Force Publique became the primary enforcers of Leopold's will, a law unto themselves in the vast, untamed interior. They were given free rein to unleash unimaginable brutality to ensure rubber quotas were met, suppressing any resistance with extreme prejudice, knowing their actions would go unchecked and often rewarded. Imagine these soldiers, heavily armed and devoid of mercy, descending upon a quiet village, their rifles at the ready, their faces grim, demanding their allocated bounty of rubber. If the collection was insufficient, if a village elder dared to protest, or if the terrified inhabitants simply could not produce the impossible amount demanded, the village would be burned to the ground, its crops destroyed, and its inhabitants subjected to unspeakable atrocities. Homes were reduced to ash, fields of vital cassava and plantains were trampled and ruined, ensuring starvation would follow where violence had led. The Force Publique's methods were calculatedly barbaric, designed to instill absolute, crippling fear, Women and children were routinely taken hostage, seized from their homes, and held captive in filthy, disease-ridden stockades, often for weeks or months. These makeshift prisons, mere enclosures of thorny branches or rough planks, were breeding grounds for dysentery, smallpox, and sleeping sickness, where captives were starved and denied even basic hygiene. Their emaciated figures, their cries echoing through the jungle, were a constant harrowing reminder to the male villagers, desperate to save their families, to venture ever deeper into the treacherous jungle to fulfill their rubber quotas. Those who resisted this monstrous system, those who attempted to flee into the dense forests, seeking freedom, or those who simply failed to produce enough rubber, were subjected to summary executions, often preceded by brutal beatings, agonizing whippings with the dreaded chicotte, or forced marches to distant collection zones. These marches, often lasting days with little food or water, were designed to break the spirit and body, leaving trails of dead and dying in their wake. But the most infamous and chilling atrocity, a symbol forever etched into the collective memory of the Congo and forever staining the legacy of Leopold II, was the systematic severing of hands. This particular horror wasn't born of random sadism, but of a chilling bureaucratic evil. Belgian officers were given strict orders to conserve ammunition. Every bullet fired had to be accounted for, and the proof, tragically, was often a severed human hand. Force publique soldiers, needing to demonstrate they hadn't wasted precious bullets on hunting game for their own sustenance or on rebels who had dared to fight back, would present baskets full of these gruesome trophies, the hands of men, women, and even innocent children, as irrefutable proof of their efficiency and discipline. This perverse administrative requirement turned human body parts into a grotesque form of currency, a ledger item in a system of mass murder. Imagine the horror. A father forced to watch his child's hand being hacked off with a dull machete because he couldn't gather enough rubber, or soldiers casually displaying baskets of shriveled, blackened hands, each a testament to an unimaginable act of violence, each a silent scream, frozen in agony. Children were often targeted for this mutilation as a deliberate terror tactic, not necessarily to account for a bullet, but as a warning, a permanent visible scar etched onto the community, leaving them permanently maimed and reliant, often for their entire lives. Entire villages lived in perpetual crushing fear of the chicotte, a whip made of sun-dried hippopotamus hide, capable of tearing flesh from bone with a single stroke, or the couper les mains, the omnipresent horrifying order to cut off hands, a ritual of administrative cruelty that became the most visceral symbol of Leopold's reign. The scale of death was catastrophic, truly biblical in its scope. Historians estimate that during Leopold's brutal reign, the population of the Congo was reduced by as much as 50%, a staggering loss of life, ranging from 8 to 10 million people, a number that justly finds its place among history's most horrific genocides, comparable in sheer magnitude to the Holocaust. This wasn't solely due to direct violence, though that was rampant and systematic, a daily reality for millions. Disease, particularly rampant epidemics like sleeping sickness and smallpox, swept through populations already weakened by starvation, forced marches, and the unsanitary, overcrowded conditions of the stockades. These diseases, often endemic, found fertile ground in bodies ravaged by trauma and malnutrition, decimating entire communities with terrifying speed. Famine, a calculated weapon of control, became endemic across the land as villagers were forced to abandon their farms and traditional food production to collect rubber, their agricultural cycles utterly destroyed. The entire social fabric of the Congo was ripped apart. Families were brutally separated, often never to be reunited. Communities displaced, their ancestral lands stolen, and inter-village conflicts ignited as desperate groups, starved and brutalized, were pitted against each other in the ruthless competition for survival or to fulfill quotas. Its people were subjected to a dehumanizing regime of terror, fear, and systematic murder for the enrichment of one man thousands of miles away in Belgium, a monarch who never once set foot in the territory he so mercilessly plundered. The civilizing mission, the noble rhetoric that had convinced the world to grant Leopold his personal fiefdom, had devolved into a genocidal horror, a landscape dotted with severed limbs, charred villages, and mass graves, all in the name of rubber and ivory. The heart of Africa was not merely dark, it was bleeding. For years, the atrocities in the Congo Free State remained largely hidden behind Leopold's carefully crafted facade of humanitarianism. His vast wealth allowed him to control the narrative, bribing journalists, circulating propaganda, and silencing critics. Missionaries, explorers, and traders who witnessed the horrors firsthand initially found their reports dismissed as exaggerations or fabrications. But even the most sophisticated web of lies eventually unravels under the weight of unimaginable truth. The turning point came with the unlikely figure of Edmond Dine Morel, a British shipping clerk. In the early 1900s, Morel noticed a disturbing discrepancy in the cargo manifests of ships traveling between Belgium and the Congo. Ships arriving in Antwerp were laden with enormous quantities of raw rubber and ivory. However, ships departing from Antwerp carried almost nothing but soldiers, firearms, ammunition, and other instruments of coercion. This stark, undeniable anomaly, vast natural resources flowing out of the Congo with no visible commercial exchange for manufactured goods flowing back in, wasn't merely unusual. It was a screaming indictment. Morel realized with chilling clarity that this could only mean one thing. The Congo was not engaged in trade. It was being systematically plundered. And its people were being forced to pay for their own enslavement and murder with their labor. He grasped that the Congolese were not trading partners, but enslaved producers, literally paying with their lives for the tools of their own subjugation, from rifles to the very parts used to construct the dreaded chicotte whips. Morel, a man of fierce moral conviction, was consumed by outrage. He resigned from his comfortable job and dedicated his life to exposing Leopold's crimes, sacrificing personal security for a relentless crusade against a king. He founded the Congo Reform Association, CRA, in 1904, a powerful international movement that quickly became a multinational coalition, bringing together missionaries, human rights activists, and prominent public figures across Europe and America. His most crucial ally was Roger Casement, a seasoned British consul who had been dispatched to the Congo in 1903 to investigate the rumors of atrocities. Casement did not merely collect rumors. He conducted meticulously documented interviews, often traveling deep into the interior, seeing with his own eyes the charred villages, the emaciated survivors, and the children with missing hands. His meticulously detailed report, published in 1904, provided official, incontrovertible evidence of widespread mutilation, forced labor, and mass murder. His words painted a horrifying picture of a territory gripped by terror, where the very landscape was soaked in blood and tears, its people reduced to chattel. The official seal of the British government behind Casement's findings gave the reports an irrefutable weight that Leopold's propaganda machine struggled to counter. Missionaries, like the courageous American Presbyterian William Henry Shepherd, began to speak out, defying colonial authorities and their own mission boards to share harrowing eyewitness accounts. Shepherd famously collected numerous severed hands as evidence, not merely as macabre trophies, but as a desperate, visceral plea for intervention. Their testimonies, often smuggled out and published in newspapers and pamphlets like the New York American, shocked the conscience of the world. But it was the nascent power of photography that truly pierced the veil of Leopold's deception. Imagine the impact of photographs showing Congolese victims with their hands amputated. Images like Alice Seeley Harris's iconic photo of Nsala, a father staring with vacant horror at the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter, circulating across Europe and America. These images, raw and uncompromising, presented an undeniable visual indictment that transcended language and propaganda. It was one thing to read about atrocities. It was another entirely to stare into the traumatized eyes of a mutilated child, holding the proof of their suffering in a photograph printed in your daily newspaper. This visual evidence made the horror personal and undeniable for a horrified Western public. Literary giants joined the cause. Joseph Conrad, whose seminal novel, Heart of Darkness, was inspired by his own harrowing journey up the Congo River, powerfully critiqued the colonial enterprise and its moral decay, its themes resonating profoundly with the unfolding revelations. And Mark Twain, with his characteristic biting wit, penned the scathing satire, King Leopold's Soliloquy, depicting the king as a hypocritical monster, mocking his self-serving piety and exposing his grotesque greed to a wide American readership. Their influence amplified the message, transforming dry reports into compelling narratives of human evil. Leopold fought back ferociously, pouring millions from his blood-soaked fortune into counter-propaganda. He established the Press Bureau in Brussels, an army of propagandists, historians, and lobbyists churning out articles, books, and alternative reports that dismissed the CRA's findings as biased, exaggerated, or simply fabricated by anti-Belgian agitators. Journalists were bribed, sympathetic academics funded, and prominent figures subtly influenced. He even attempted to discredit Casement by questioning his character and motivations, launching vicious smear campaigns. But the sheer volume of consistent independent evidence, the meticulous shipping records unearthed by Morel, the official reports of diplomats like Casement, the harrowing testimonies of missionaries, and the undeniable photographs collected by activists like Harris, steadily broke through the wall of denial. The relentless campaigning of the CRA, uniting disparate voices under a single banner of moral outrage, proved too powerful for even a king's vast fortune to silence. The truth, gruesome and undeniable, was finally penetrating the world's consciousness, and the philanthropist king was slowly but surely revealed as one of history's most monstrous tyrants, his crown irrevocably stained with the blood of millions. The relentless international pressure, fueled by figures like E.D. Morel, Roger Casement, and the collective moral outcry of the Congo Reform Association, finally became too great for King Leopold II to withstand. The revelations of his crimes in the Congo Free State had become a global scandal, transforming his meticulously crafted image of a benevolent monarch into that of a monstrous tyrant. Parliaments in Britain, the United States, and across Europe buzzed with indignant speeches, and public squares saw passionate demonstrations demanding an end to the rubber terror and the millions of innocent lives it had claimed. International opinion had irrevocably turned against him, casting a long, dark shadow over Belgium's diplomatic standing and threatening its commercial interests. Even his own Belgian government, once complicit in the facade, now felt the immense weight of international condemnation. Grappling with the shame and economic isolation Leopold's personal fiefdom had brought upon the nation. In 1908, cornered by the prospect of total international isolation and an unwinnable propaganda war, Leopold II was finally forced to relinquish his personal ownership of the Congo. This wasn't a selfless act of contrition, but a shrewd, final maneuver to preserve his ill-gotten gains. He sold the Congo Free State to the Belgian government for an astronomical sum of 50 million francs, an unimaginable fortune at the time, equivalent to hundreds of millions of modern dollars. This audacious transaction effectively ensured his personal fortune, amassed through unimaginable suffering and murder, remained intact and unpunished. The territory was then formally annexed and rebranded as the Belgian Congo, transitioning from a private estate to a traditional colony administered by the Belgian state. While this transfer brought an end to the most egregious, systematic atrocities of Leopold's personal regime, particularly the widespread mutilation and direct terror, the fundamental injustices of colonialism, forced labor, and resource exploitation would tragically continue for decades under Belgian rule, albeit with a slightly less overt and brutal hand. The core economic model remained unchanged: extract resources for European benefit at the expense of the Congolese people. Leopold II died a year later in 1909, barely a year after the transfer of the Congo, having successfully shielded himself from any accountability for his crimes. His public funeral was a study in stark contrasts: official pomp and ceremony for the sovereign, yet met with palpable public disdain and outright boos as his funeral carriage passed through the streets of Brussels, a rare and damning display of popular contempt for a deceased monarch. In a final desperate act of historical revisionism, he ordered the destruction of his personal archives, attempting to erase all evidence of his monstrous reign. "I shall give them my Congo," he reportedly declared, "but they have no right to know what I did there." Yet, despite his best efforts to wipe the slate clean, the truth meticulously preserved in the harrowing testimonies of survivors, the meticulously documented reports of investigators like Casement, the tireless work of reformers like Morel, and the haunting photographs collected by activists like Alice Seeley Harris, could not be wholly annihilated. The collective memory of the victims, though scarred, would eventually outlive the tyrant's deliberate amnesia. The legacy of Leopold II on the Congo, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, is profound, devastating, and tragically enduring. The systematic extermination of its population, estimated by some to be as many as 10 to 15 million people, represented one of history's most horrific genocides. Beyond the sheer demographic catastrophe, his rule brought about the destruction of indigenous social structures, the decimation of local economies, and an economic exploitation that stripped its vast natural resources, rubber, ivory, minerals, while leaving its people in generations of abject poverty and underdevelopment. These scars run deep, manifesting in persistent instability, systemic corruption, and a cycle of conflict that continues to plague the nation. The DRC remains a country grappling with the lingering effects of Leopold's rapacious rule, its immense potential, stifled by the enduring consequences of a colonial past built on unimaginable cruelty and resource extraction. Meanwhile, the immense wealth Leopold amassed from the Congo funded lavish palaces, grand public parks, and monumental public works throughout Belgium. enduring architectural testaments that stand as silent, deeply uncomfortable reminders of a fortune stained by the blood of millions, a chilling historical paradox that still sparks fierce debate and calls for reconciliation. King Leopold II stands as a stark and chilling figure in the annals of history, a potent symbol of unchecked power, insatiable greed, and the destructive capacity of colonialism taken to its most horrific extreme. His story is not merely a tale of historical atrocity. It is a perpetual warning, etched in the severed hands and lost lives of the Congolese people, against the seductive dangers of moral expediency, the insidious power of propaganda, and the terrifying vacuum that opens when humanity is sacrificed at the altar of profit. His reign offers an indelible lesson on the corrupting nature of absolute power and the catastrophic consequences when the world averts its gaze from human suffering. From the diplomatic salons of Europe to the blood-soaked jungles of the Congo, King Leopold II engineered a horror almost beyond human comprehension. His was a reign built on lies, fueled by greed, and measured in millions of lost lives, leaving an indelible scar on the heart of Africa and a chilling legacy of unchecked power. His story stands as a monument to the darkest impulses of colonialism and a stark reminder of the profound cost of silence in the face of atrocity. Thank you for confronting this brutal chapter of history with us. Until next time, let us remember that the lessons of the past, however painful, must never be forgotten if we are to forge a more just future.